All right, so our next speaker is Diani from the ICREA, the University at Pabra in Barcelona, and he spent his career, as most of you know, studying social movements, going way back to his dissertation on the environmental movement in New York.
Thank you. I don't know if you are familiar with the joke. My version of the joke is set in Ireland. The English guy who arrives at Dublin station, we notices that all the clocks at the end of each platform have a different time, and he asks the station manager why is it the case, and the manager replies, well, if they all mark the same time, one would be more than enough. There would be no point in having many. And in a way, the logic applies to my presentation, because what you will find in the USB is there are the ingredients of what I'm going to say now, but the order of the talk is different, and also there are some more tape graphs in the presentation that I might use or might not, depending on how things evolve. There is two reasons to that. One is not particularly good at structuring talks beforehand. Two, also it's also important to react to what has been said this morning. And basically, my talk is driven by an exercise I started 20 years ago when I decided, having been in the business of studying social movements for 10 years, having started building some kind of reputation, I didn't know what I was talking about. In the sense that one characteristic of the debate in social movement research is that sooner or later, when you're talking about some phenomenon, some kind of collective action, somebody will start asking, is this a social movement or is it something else? Or is this particular group a social movement organization or something else? So I decided that at least I need to, being a social movement expert, I need to clarify myself a little bit on that matter, and it's worked in the sense that I built a career on that, which is pretty wonderful. And I think I also, however, in the process developed a couple of ideas that might be useful to the current discussion. And the bottom line is I would like to start very explicitly with some very banal, but at the same time I think not so recognized considerations. And the first one is the fact that we should disentangle social movements from collective action, including social movements from contentious collective action. Contentious collective action is an attempt to produce collective goods through cooperation, targeting some kind of actor who is blamed, right or wrong, for being responsible of the grievance that we want to address. Even collective action, even on the of the protest type, does not necessarily, as I'm going to show, develop or get coordinated through social movements. I think, and then there are phenomena. There is a more complex set of dynamics going on. And what I propose is that we take a step back and we look at two very elementary dilemmas that any kind of actor willing to coordinate collective action has to face to some extent. And one is basically a problem of allocating, coordinating resource exchanges. Collective action implies pooling some level of resources, maybe symbolic, maybe purely visual, maybe that's a problem for discussion, but collective action implies joining, putting together resources in pursuit of a certain goal. Second, however, collective action also implies another elementary dilemma, basically addressing a dilemma of boundary definition. What do we mean by that? I mean that collective action implies inevitably precisely a definition of who is the actor, on behalf of what type of collectivity is the action being conducted, and against what type of collectivity is the action being promoted. And what you see in the logic, what I'm going to present is a model that basically takes explicitly into account two possible responses to this dilemma, two possible levels at which responses to this dilemma may be elaborated, and keeps a third level in the background. And the level is basically that the explicit levels are given by the dilemma that collective action takes place, develops in the context not of single actors through the aggregation of single actors, but in the context of fields. Sometimes the focus of the decision-making process is regarding resource allocation takes place at the level of the field. Other times takes place at the level of specific bounded actors with a defining capacity. More on this later. And likewise, the definition of the boundary sometimes takes place at the level of specific actors with clear boundaries. Sometimes takes place at field level. In order to make sense of the dynamics that occur between these in fields, it's also good to look at the multiplexity, namely the possibility there will be different types of ties connecting different actors at different points in time. As I said, therefore, the explicit level of my analysis is a level of organizations and the level of organizational fields. Underlying that, however, there is also a level which is important to consider, the level of the individuals. Individuals can be conceived from different angles. Can be conceived as parts, as members or involved as members of association, but they can also be considered as actors operating independently. This morning we heard a lot about individuals who were politically active or promoting collective action without passing through the mediation of specific organizations. So the role of, I would mention individuals during my talk repeatedly, but the basic typology I'm going to present is built on the assumption that there will be different responses to these basic dilemmas at different, depending on the different role played by organizational fields in relation to specific organizations. The idea I use is an idea of modes of coordination. And actually, these are analytic categories. What I'm saying, they are not saying that the goal of the exercise is not to identify boxes in which we can fit entirely any concrete example of collective action. These are analytic. I think that the typology is best understood if we take these as criteria that we use to interpret a particular concrete instance of collective action with the view of trying to understand how different logics of action or different modes of coordination coexist in a specific situation, and what does this combination tell us about the collective action processes going on. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that very often, even including those that we often call social movements, the coordination takes place mostly at the organizational level. What do you mean by that? I mean that very often what we see are the level of decision making regarding resource allocation very often is within specific organizations. Even within movements, most organizations that are associated to movements very often conduct actions and promote actions in their own terms. And what does it mean? It means that the decision regarding what to do, what strategies, what tactics to adopt, how to use the available resources, how to try to mobilize new resources, is taken within a group which is which says relatively clearly defined. Relatively defined means that there is a shared notion of what is the interaction setting in which decisions are taken. It may be in the case of a formal organization, can be a board, or can be any level that the rules of the organization define. But this logic can also be found in reference to small informal groups, community action group, neighborhood action group. No need to have a formal structure, but as long as they constitute a relatively tight subset of actors who recognize each other as being part of a certain entity, and decide how to allocate resources, then we can speak, I think, in this sense of decisions that are taking place at the level of specific organization. The other thing is that the level of the, sorry, I was meaning this dimension. The other element is that very often the identities of the unit tend to be associated with specific actors. Namely, the most important allegiance also of commitment or identification is with the organization. And one example are, for example, sectarian groups in phases of radicalization of movements. Italy in the 1970s, there were plenty of radical organizations claiming to be the owners of the revolutionary truth. They were, in which really very often the identification was much more with the organization itself, rather than shared at the broader level of the field. Very often, if you think of sectarian groups, very often sectarian groups elaborate the definition of themselves as being the only representative of the cause, the only legitimate representative of the cause, and the fact that they are actually operating in a field in which other actors follow the same, aspire broadly to the same goal, does not mean that they share in any ways a particularly distinctive commonality with those other actors. To the contrary, very often other actors are the traitors of the cause. Stalinism is provided, the history of communism is provided innumerable examples of this kind. We can very easily dig on our own examples of sectarianism to recognize this logic. The paradoxical thing is that, and this applies also to far less radical or sectarian groups, very often what we call movements are actually aggregation of actors with shared interests. Think very often environmentalism consists, environmentalism is taken as a sum of organizations promoting causes, for protection of white cats, for protection of black cats, protection of pigs, protection of cows, of horses, or whatever. And because they deal with something which is linked to the environment, then we draw the conclusion that this should be treated as an environmental movement. What happens? What has been the response very often within social movement theory to the fact that clearly movements are not only about that. Movements are what we see when we see a big movement in the making. We see an experience which cannot be reduced to specific organized actor, clearly. And I suggested that the peculiarity of a movement is not that of suggesting a model which is totally opposite to the organizational one, but is that of representing a situation in which there is a tension between the organizational level at the level of dynamics that take place at the broader organizational field. What I think is distinctive in analytic terms of a social movement process, or a social movement mode of coordination, is the fact that actors within a social movement dynamic experience a double sense of loyalty. They may feel part of an organization, they may feel part of a specific bounded group, but at the same time they feel part of a broader entity. They feel part of a broader collective actor, which is whose boundaries are vaguely defined, but which nevertheless is aiming in a direction, in some kind of shared direction. And they develop a sense of mutual obligation to some level in relation not to actors who go beyond the boundaries of the specific action to which one can be associated. So there is a tension between identities and sense of boundaries defined at the level of specific groups, organizations, and a sense of identification with the broader collective entity. And this is something which is regularly constantly negotiated and renegotiated. The other element is that the decisions about the allocation of resources, once again, need to be taken through a negotiation between the logic of specific organized actors and the logic of the broader extending the collective actor. A decision in a social movement dynamic is precisely the extreme case of a social movement dynamic is that what we have in more in a situation in which there is no clear leader, everything has to be negotiated, everything has to be worked out. The more we run into mechanisms whereby there is a defined procedure, no matter how loose, no matter how vague, for taking decisions, the less we are into a social movement mode of coordination, the more we are getting closer to an organizational logic. What I think social classic social movement theory, the classic agenda, as the way it has dealt with this problem has been by stressing the link between organizations and coalitions. I don't know what your reading of social movement theory is, but I think there is a curious mismatch between the coalition, the argument that the role the concept of coalition plays in social movement theory and the role of the network. For social movement, for the classic social movement, this is the kind of problem that I have had continuously with these friends. For social movement people, the network, when you speak of networks, the network is the set of normally interpersonal ties that facilitate the involvement of people in collective action. When you move to interorganizational relations, most of them switch to the concept of coalition. Now, the concept of coalition is fine, but it is only partial because analytically the concept of coalition simply means that the decisions regarding the allocation of resources are taken at the level of the field. But the concept of coalition per se doesn't imply any sense of boundary definition. You may have coalition work which is totally instrumental, given by instrumental consideration, and which doesn't require, and does not imply the fact that the actors involved share any kind of broader understanding of reality, share any kind of longer-term solidarity. This is whereas instead, the idea of the boundary means that, this is very important, I forgot to mention that. The idea of the boundary means that there is a continuity in the way that actors perceive themselves as part of a collectivity, which goes beyond any single specific event. The logic of a movement is a logic whereby people are capable of building mechanisms of identity. By identity in the sense, for example, Alessandro Pizzorno used identity as capacity to build, as connectedness. Identity is a capacity to build, you can read identity as a capacity to build connection. Our identity rests on this capacity. We build connection between episodes in our lives, between people in our lives, and organize them in a coherent way. At the collective level, a mechanism of boundary definition implies the definition of an identity which consists of creating connection. You have a movement in place because people who are acting in Wall Street are capable of connecting mechanisms, connecting what they are doing, what is happening in Barcelona rather than in Tel Aviv, rather than in other connections, and assign to these events a shared meaning. Identity doesn't mean being similar. Identity means being capable of identifying some common element. That is a fundamental problem in the social movement dynamic. So I think that looking at coalitions and treating the whole, as I think most of social movement theory currently does, treating the whole set of interorganizational relations within the boundary of the logic of coalition, I think is correct empirically in many ways, but it is also an important analytic limitation. Now we come to the interesting bit, which is where the role of individuals come back in a most strong way. What I call here subculture or communitarian mode of coordination is not inconceivable. It's actually pretty frequent. The fact that when collective action gets coordinated, not because there are organizations doing the role, but organization may exist or may not exist. But what's important is that what happens is that still actors operate recognizing as part of a broader field, developing a sense of identification and commitment to a broader collective cause, but without necessarily organizations getting to work together. Very often the coordination very often can take place through the contribution of individual activities who are connected to other channels. And this, you can find a mechanism of this kind in a totally different range of empirical cases. Sometimes you may find this in situations in which formally an authoritarian political system prevents organizational life from taking place, and in particular prevents that very important public activity, which is the coalition building. And in which case, actors who try to mobilize rely more on the ties that they develop through, for example, through legal activities One recent example of that is the role of the mosque in Arab countries, but you can find examples. The church in Spain, when during Franco, was an important source. There is evidence of that, both in Catalonia or in the Basque Country. There are innumerable examples in which there are people draw upon connections that are not linked necessarily to organization. This can apply also in situations that, it seems to me, is a form of coordinated collective action which is very much akin to what we have seen in the last year or so in the Western world, and definitely comes close, it seems to me, to what we have seen, what we have this morning. Now, what are I think the advantages of thinking of social movements and in general disentangling social movements from collective action per se? I think the advantage is that first we can try to get out of what I think is a mismatch between an analytic use of the category of the movement and a sort of more public legitimating use of the category of the movement. Very often the category of the movement is used in rhetorical terms to assign legitimacy to a certain form of action, to stress the fact that it does not, there is something which is not, cannot be reduced to the action of political parties or interest groups, which are perceived as being lacking legitimacy in the current phase. Therefore, the argument, this is a movement, very often discussion of what a phenomenon is a movement or not is driven by this type of occupation. I think they are legitimate, but I don't think they are analytically useful. The other point is that I think and I think this is the biggest advantage, is that it separates to some extent in the analysis of change, what are the changes, from the analysis of the contents of the change. Very often we discuss, we've bumped into some of these problems. I think this morning very often the discussion around movement center about what is different from the past. But here, what is different from the past can really be can mean two different things. It can mean that action takes place in forms which are analytically different to what was being seen before, or it can mean that the response that in a specific phase we see given to some of the basic dilemmas that I have highlighted is different from what we were used to see, is different from what we were accustomed to experience. Talking about the first side of the story, what is analytically different, I think this model tells us, for example, something about the transformation of movement. For example, when we think about the institutionalization of movement, we tend to think, okay, we apply a logic mechanism which are referred actually to specific actors to the movement as a whole. Namely, the institutionalization of movement is assessed for example, by looking at whether organizations are becoming more bureaucratic, more professional oriented, Therefore, the pattern of change is, the analysis of change is linked to the specific transformation of specific actors within. If you apply network logic, for example, we can read the transformation of a movement, for example, in the terms of the weakening of the sense of collective identification, a growing influence on the identification of specific organization, a growing division of labor, a reduced level of negotiation between actors regarding what to do, and an increased importance of decision making taken at the level of organization. This is not tantamount to content, because this logic passes, for example, from a social movement to an organizational logic can apply to a different case. It can apply, for example, to environmentalism. Environmentalism may develop in some cases as an attempt to challenge a certain mode of production, but then when it gets institutionalized, sometimes, in some cases not always, you can see the growth of specific single issue interest groups. more interested in working on their own, less interested in establishing a general agenda. But it can also mean, to the opposite, a process transformation, the passage from a social movement logic to an organizational logic can also reflect a logic of growing sectarianization of a movement. For example, a movement breaks solidarity, the case I was mentioning earlier. A movement collapses when its internal components start fighting against each other, and following an organizational logic, which is totally different from the first one, but is still focused on the role of specific actors rather than the role of a broader field. And likewise, you can use, for example, you can see similar mechanisms. You can think easily of passage from one logic to the other as correspond to as many patterns of change within in the logics of collective action. So that's one level. And I think it is useful. And the advantage of this is, for example, you move away the discussion from issues which are considered as obsolete, but which keep coming up. For example, what is the difference between an interest group or a formally constituted or a social movement? It's not a matter of defining the peculiarity of social movement organizations per se as opposed to other organizational patterns. The problem is the question is what are, under certain circumstances, which facilitate the involvement of political parties or formal interest groups in social movement in some cases but not in others. For example, that becomes the question. And you can reformulate the fundamental question of social movement analysis in this logic. What is another, going to the context, it's clear we are facing big issues because how do you assess boundary definition? And for the logic that I have followed in my previous work has been relying a lot on the multiple involvements of activists of the organization. Following very much a Simmelian, very much Georg Simmels type of logic, the intersection of social circles. The group membership, the membership of individuals define the boundaries of collectivity, and in turn individuals are defined by the multiple groups to which they belong. So if you use that logic, if you use the logic of multiple memberships, in reference to and you map the underlying ties between different types of organizations, looking at how the members create bridges, you can really make a relational proxy, identify a relational proxy for boundaries. I got the data there, but I'm not going to talk about them. Perhaps in the discussion, I can illustrate how it works. But what comes out very clearly from this morning and from reality is to what extent do we really need interpersonal, interpersonal face-to-face connection to build boundaries of collectivity. This morning we have had many very telling compelling stories about how other sources of information, other sources of communication can contribute to create a sense of commonality, etc. And I think this is a potential line. These are some of the big questions that I would like, that I think should be addressed. So in this sense, I don't think, my impression, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but my impression is not that Internet is changing entirely the logic of the mechanism to which collective action operates, is coordinated, but I think it may drastically contribute to alter the conditions, for example, through which sense of even negotiation, but indefinitely, both negotiation regarding the use of resources and in particular the definition of identities are actually conducted. And so I think I can stop here and let's see how the discussion evolves. Thank you.
Yes, Bruce.
I like to think about one of the chief consequences of people's use of digital media as entailing the breakdown of boundaries of all kinds between the private and the public, between the individual and the organization, between organizations themselves, between who's a member and who's not a member. And so if I think in those terms, and also I think about one of the consequences of use of digital media being that networks are enormously flexible and don't have a fixed structure that are necessarily always dense or sparse, but they're latent, they're rhizomatic. Different elements of networks are activated over time, and so we always have to think about a network in time to be able to assess what its shape is. And so when I think about that, I'm not clear on what the distinctions are between field level and organization level, or dense and sparse. And I imagine that, like, as is the case for many 2x2s, you may actually really mean to represent dimensions here, right? So if we make these dimensions kind of along the lines of what Steve did, then my question to you would be, isn't it the case that a lot of the interesting action is happening in the middle, right? Where it's not clear what's a field, what's an organization, and so on. And so how do we tell a story if that turns out to be, just stipulate with me, if that turns out to be what's interesting?
All right, this is my laziness, that I think I agree with the best representation would be a continuum rather than a dichotomous type of logic. But at the other level, that's exactly what you say regarding the, that's exactly my one of the inspiring, the rationale behind this type of mechanism is, as I said at the beginning, I'm talking about what do I mean by analytic? I mean analytic precisely that what is interesting in seeing what are the combinations of different possible logics of action in certain specific cases. So the problem with the classic logic of analysis, the question would be, where do we fit the indignados, for example? Do they fit in here, 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 there? This would be, I think, less interesting for some of the reasons that you mentioned. I would suggest instead it's more interesting to see how you can, whether you can find within a certain episode of collective action different logics going on, and what are the, how does it happen, for example, that certain movement dynamics do not last forever or get transformed into something different. And the question of time, yes, it is absolutely true, but this is, as I said, this is where the problem is how to go about this in time. My work, one of the limitations of my work so far has been that I have been doing network analysis on real data. I've done faced problems finding reliable data over time. It's very difficult. If you look at the inter-organizational ties between actors, you can have the proxies you have, for example, inferring to a two-mode logical analysis from newspaper report. You can play with that, but it's very distant from getting a whole picture of fields. For example, so presents a limitation. But regarding boundaries, yes, I mean, I agree. We do it at one level, but the question is how we define the boundary. I still think that in order to support, carry a collective action to some extent, you need a sense of what is the we and what is the them, us and them. And if you don't have that, your capacity to, I have seen no evidence that if you are short of that, your capacity to act continuously is really guaranteed. It may be a statement of faith, but I haven't seen, I don't know of any instance of successful and sustained mobilization that doesn't have some level of, I think, as a matter of fact, one of the problems of the 91 versus 1% logic is precisely that the 99 is too broad and 1% is too small to carry on a sustained successful mobilization over time, but this is my impression.
Look, can I follow up on Bruce's? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
1, 2, 3, and then.
Well, that's a nice moment to think about it, Matt. I mean, I think you've laid out for us the map of conventional social movements, both parts that may move into social movement coalition formations, or remain apart from fragmenting the coalition or social movement. But by this scheme of things, I think what most of us have been talking about so far today are not social movements. Now, there is the reification problem. I mean, do we want to hold the definition of social movements separate from reality, or do we want to, well, which a lot of people do. So paradigms being what they are, reality pales by comparison. But I don't think, you've been at odds with many of your colleagues in the social movement paradigm. But I think that the idea of what you just said, the 1% and the 99%, isn't strong enough. Well, in other ways, I would claim, and I will claim tonight, if any of you are still awake.
Keep the secret. Keep the secret.
That is not only strong enough, but because it's a different kind of organization than anything you've got going on here, it needs to be like that. And it has sustained itself in this rhizomatic way. And so, Indignados, Tahrir Square, Occupy, the Israeli formation are off your chart.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I think they are.
I think they're here.
You think they're there?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, but see, I often see sparseness is not what's characteristic.
I said, sorry, I was not clear. There is a third element which are the individuals. Here is the level, I start from the inter-organizational logics, and I say it is totally possible that collective action may be mobilized, but in contents in which the inter-organizational logic and networks are not particularly dense or not existent at all, and still there is a sense of commonality which derives from the fact that the individual actors are identified through other means. And this
But you don't like 99 as a collective action.
Sorry?
You sort of said you don't like the 99 as a collective. It's not a typical collective action.
No, sorry. Yeah, but because you are. It's a matter of saying. As I said in the beginning, collective action is one. I think the core issue is collective action. I think that Occupy and 99 is perfectly right as an instance of collective action. I mean, if you want to call a movement, I think you call a movement because it sounds better in terms of legitimacy. But if we treat every collective action which goes on as movement, I think we are sometimes very strongly missing the point. Because the analytic point, Occupy Wall Street is not important because it is a movement. It is important depending on our persuasion. It is important. It is important because it raises great questions and gives answer to them. Or I'm simply saying, it's not the category of social movement is not everything which moves. I think it should be used in a more restrained way, and I think that would clarify some misunderstanding, but I accept it's a hard struggle. There was some Richard.
So this morning I was continually vexed by the question of the difference between network and movement, you know, and you've made a very, very clear distinction between the two, whereas the presentations this morning used terms like networked social movements. They used one time I heard the term socially networked movements, and then I remember that there was an influential paper in sort of NGO circles, maybe about 8 years ago, called "Movement as Network." I don't know if you read that paper by Gideon Rosenblatt, I think it was called. So over the last, with the rise of the internet and more recently with social media, over the last 10 years, we've heard all these sort of hybrid terms where the term network and movement are used together. So are you a purist? So you would say this social movements over here and networks?
No. I would simply say that social movement is a particular form of network organization. This would be my take. There is I'm simply saying that there are, which is embedded in other types of networks, networks of individuals, of activists, etc. But I would say that the particular form, there are other network forms here, or if you think in terms of network, this is a dense network, which is simply what is different is the type of relation that passes between the actors. This is another type of network. This is a known network, it's a sparse network, and this is a network which is disconnected at the level of the organization, but it is actually connected through the activities and the communication between the individual activists which are below the inter-organizational level. I should show really a three-level type of scheme. No, over there.
No, sorry. So I really like that you mentioned Simmel and the notion of multiplexity that you talked at the beginning. Simmel's, the way he describes the difference between a dyad and a triad is, I think, really important for this notion of multiplexity, right? So this idea that when you have just two people and you're trying to coordinate action, if I say I'm going to do it, then you bet your bottom I'm going to have to do it because I have some kind of affinity or some kind of responsibility to you. But anytime you get groups or 3 or more together, people might agree to do things that then shift the burden to the group. They might do a lax job or something of that nature. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about resource coordination networks, what are the different problems that these groupings run into when they're trying to coordinate collective action, say to get you know,
I would
people
say,
in the
listen,
street?
it's difficult to generalize, but I would say this, that alliance building, you can think of alliance building as a kind of it's a kind of investigative process. When you start an alliance, organizations need allies. At the same time, you know, alliance implies some kind of compromise or giving up some of your distinctiveness, and it implies some level of trust, because your partner can defect, or your partner can try to impose their own lines on the campaign and not respect your goals. Therefore, if you are compromising with somebody who doesn't compromise in terms of ideological line, you lose some of your symbolic capital on your in relation to, for example, to your capacity to mobilize members, and so you need. So alliance building is a kind of it's a process of investigation, and the more costly the action, the more this process is important, and the more it becomes dependent on the fact that your organization is embedded in a field where there are interpersonal connections with other organizations. So if I would say this would be my take. And as a matter of fact, I don't have the time to show that. I did analysis in British cities where you would get, in each city the network would be, you would have densely connected and disconnected sections of the network. But between organizations that were densely connected, there were at least 2 types of positions. In one case, the inter-organizational alliances were embedded in dense interpersonal ties, relatively more dense. In the other case, this didn't happen. I suggested these 2 corresponded to a social movement and a coalitional logic. As a matter of fact, if you ask the guys, do you have specific opponents for your action, the proportion of organizations telling yes, we have specific opponents, was much higher among groups that were linked by a double logic, namely where they were closer to a logic of social movement as I defined, and there is in the other case this didn't happen. There is a paper by myself and Gizong in Theory and Society 2004 where we started showing some of these logical analysis. So yes, I mean, I think there is, in this sense, there is a the structure of interpersonal ties that affects the way alliance building takes place. Sasha?
Yeah. So I really like the emphasis on thinking about what the social movement theory about coalitions has to tell us when we think about network forms of organization. I think that's really important, and we're not doing that enough. I also think that I guess I'm in agreement with you that some of the current cycle of struggle isn't fitting for me into this typology. And I've been trying to think about this question and what terms could be more specific and more useful in understanding what's happening with the social movement space. And part of it is that I think we're seeing sort of simultaneous and parallel participation in movement actions and events by all of these different types of actors, right? So it's from individuals who are unaffiliated, who may even be a bystander one moment to an action and then step in. There are organizations, there are affinity groups, there are meso-mobilization organizations, there are coalitions that are formal and informal, there are network forum organizations, there are ad hoc organizations, and I've ended up I keep going back to this term of social movement formation, which is what I use to talk about the set of all of these different kind of actors that are participating at a particular moment in time in a particular social movement process. Because anything else, I end up feeling like the term is too specific to include the range of actors. So, personally, that's where I've ended up.
I would counter that you're using the question here is a matter of epistemological preferences, theoretical preferences. I think I would counter simply that I don't personally don't have the need to find the concept for any phenomena that I am analyzing. I mean, what you say, for example, is, as I read it, is a classic example of a series of events, I repeat, of collective action. If you want to call them social movements, fine, but you might call them John or Veronica, it would work exactly the same way. But if you want to call them social movements, it's perfectly all right. But what you're seeing is the convergence, the combination of different mechanisms of action. I'm not interested in saying precisely that the case we discussed this morning fit here, 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 or here. What I'm interested in, for example, is whether the model enables me to capture some changes in the processes, for example. And what we had this morning, somebody was saying, somebody decided to constitute an organization out of that. This is an interesting process because from a situation of a totally loose individual, there is an organization coming up. I'm interested, for example, in seeing how this organization of form will relate to the others. What type of connection there will be, or what this will imply for example, for the indignados if there is a formal organization coming up. So I'm simply saying I use this as a framework, as a lens to watch and map specific situations. What the specificity of the situation is an historical contingent matter, and the question is whether we have categories that enable us to capture the essential processes. And of course, with a 2x2 table, you don't capture all the essential processes. I would be content to capture some useful mechanism. There was you and then Michael.
So I just wonder, since that you talked a lot about this network structure, but we don't really see a lot about the content of networks here. What types of network? I guess relate to your question, but the social movement itself is kind of network. And also, it bothered me a little bit why this organization will be failing to the category of sparse resource coordination network. In my point of view, it seems organization, as we think about a corporation that has a strict hierarchy, say who should support who is subject to whose command. That is exactly very dense, resource coordination network in that
Absolutely,
sense.
that's why this, wasn't clear enough. This is reflects the analysis at the level of the field. So the resource coordination network is sparse at the level of the field. But clearly, each organization has its own logic of coordination internally. What I'm interested in is that there are organizations, groups, more or less formed, that then operate in a field. Sometimes the coordination at the level of the field is dense. Sometimes it is sparse. But this is not to say an organization also simply means that it's like a classical example, very unpopular, I suppose, among us. Then the relation between the Nazi Party and the Nazi movement. The Nazi movement was a galaxy of a range of organizations. Then gradually one became dominant. It doesn't mean that there was not coordination. There was a lot of coordination in the Nazi Party format. But they all took place within the boundaries of a certain organization. So what was missing was the relation between actors, which is typical of movement dynamics, the negotiation between actors. The more you have more movement dynamic, when there is more, everything has to be renegotiated. It's a little bit like the nation according to Ernest Renan. Social movement is a plebiscite every day. Every day you decide you are into the process, you are in that's the difference. But at the level of specific actors, I totally agree with you. Michael?
Yeah, I think that there is something new here, but I'm not sure we really know what it is. My sense is that what's new about networked organization is not that organizations are networked. What's new is that organizational theorists have finally come to understand that all organizations are networked. And what's new about networked social movements is not that social movements are networked, it's that finally social movement theorists have come to recognize that all social movements are networked. And what's new about
probably the two of us.
Wait, it gets worse. It gets worse. What's new about the role of social media in the Arab Spring is not that the revolution was tweeted in the sense that social media was an essential component in allowing this to happen or shaped it. What's new and revolutionary about social media in Arab Spring is that social media allowed us to observe.
I couldn't agree. I'm not sure about the social media and the Arab, but the rest I couldn't agree more. I'm not saying this is new, I'm simply saying this is not what in our field many people tend to think. Because as I said, the use of the networks for most of our colleagues are what facilitates your decision to participate in my decision to stay home. And when it comes to inter-organizational relations, it's coalition. We need to bring the different levels together in slightly more complex models. But that's all.
Yes,
Sure.
It strikes me that your boundary definition is actually something that you've talked a lot about previously in your work, which is identity and the ways that social movements begin to see themselves rather than a kind of level of analysis problem. And I wonder if that process of identity formation lends itself in some ways to talking about what's new here, right? The ability for identity formation to outstrip and outrun resource coordination in a way that hasn't been done previously. So people can begin to orient themselves and think about themselves as participating, but do it at such a distance, right? And so we have identification without necessarily the contribution of, to use the atoms versus bits thing, right? Without the contribution of atoms type of resource exchange networks that we're getting at. Is that part of where you're going?
Can I give you a simple example? When we think of emergence of a movement, we think very often about new actors, organizations being created, new people changing their minds, people who are passive becoming active, and there is all. I mean, it's not a matter of denying this. Obviously, it happens. It is important that we know that in phases of high social change, the 70s, the rate of organization formation is higher than in other moments. That's not the problem. The only problem is that not the whole story. Very often, the story of the emergence of a movement is not only the emergence of new actors, the recombination, the reshuffling of relations between existing actors. For example, actors that come to recognize themselves as having something in common, which was not the case before. And this is a logic which applies at the level of individuals when you need to mobilize them into action, but it also applies at the level of organizations. Think of the environment. One of the things why environmentalism, at least in Italy and other European countries, became strong in the 80s was that there was, or at least the form that it took in the 80s was that there were systematic alliances between conservation groups and political ecology, so-called groups. They were not there before. Why was there? It's not that they were not acting on the issues. It was that there were, for example, in many countries, definitely in Italy, there was a stronger cultural interpretation, the ideological cleavage, which it led groups to read their action in following different logic. For example, left-wing groups would not consider being allied with conservation groups because they consider them more too moderate, too much concerned with rationalizing the system rather than challenging its basic presupposition, etc. And the science of the left-right cleavage diminished. I'm not saying it disappeared, but it diminished. And this certainly facilitated the creation of new alliances. Or think of feminism, come on. Feminism, in many countries, feminism was the diminished strength of a logic based on class and ideology, and the development of some notions of commonality based on another dimension. And there are some studies even about Northern Ireland. Women tried to bridge the Protestant versus Catholic gap. That was before Good Friday settlement, and now everything is finished, of course. But I mean, so really, the emergence of a movement is reshuffling and creating, redesigning the map of solidarity, the map of friends and foes to some extent. The more new a movement is, the newer a movement is, the more it's because this process is strong.
We probably need to draw a line under there. Thank you again, Mario.
Thank you.